What if I told you that uh, a country could basically double the price of everything it produces, create absolutely zero new goods, and politicians would still throw a massive parade celebrating a booming economy?
I mean, it sounds completely absurd.
Right. It sounds like a joke, but it happens all the time. So welcome to today's custom-tailored deep dive.
We are really glad you're joining us for this one.
Yeah, because, when you study something like, say, the price of a single cup of coffee or why a specific local business had to close down, you're essentially looking at a single tree.
Exactly. It's detailed, it's specific, and you can map out every single branch of that one tree.
But today, for you, our listener, we are stepping back, like way, way back,
Right.
because you wanted us to take the massive, frankly, intimidating macroeconomic engine of an entire country and somehow make it click.
Which is no small task.
No, definitely not. We aren't looking at a single tree today. We are mapping the entire forest.
And doing that requires a completely different analytical toolkit. You're
Yeah.
no longer looking at individual decisions. You're looking at the ecosystem as a whole, right?
Right.
You're tracking how broad weather patterns affect the soil, or how a drought on one side of the forest fundamentally alters the wildlife behavior on the other side.
And we've got a really fantastic stack of materials to help us build those tools today.
Yeah.
We are pulling from two incredibly dense, detailed academic frameworks.
They are very thorough.
Oh, yeah. One covers broad macroeconomics and the other drills way down into aggregate supply. But to make sure this doesn't just sound like us reading a theoretical textbook to you, we are testing these frameworks against reality.
Which is where it gets really interesting.
Totally. We're using a highly relevant news brief from The Guardian about consumer confidence just completely collapsing during a war.
It really is the perfect combination. The academic frameworks give us the structural blueprints of how an economy is supposed to work, you
Yeah.
know? And then the news snippet shows us exactly what happens to those blueprints when they are subjected to real-world chaos.
Okay, so let's unpack this. If we are going to understand this entire forest, we first need to understand the water cycle that sustains it. Like, how does money actually circulate?
Right, the plumbing of the economy.
Exactly. Economists refer to this as the circular flow of income. And to grasp it, they start with the absolute simplest version of reality possible,
They strip away all the complexity. They look at what is essentially a two-sector model.
which is just, what, two groups?
Yeah, in this hypothetical world, there are only two entities. You have households, which is you, me, every other regular person, and firms, which are the businesses actually producing things.
And what's fascinating about this foundational model is that the households hold all the power initially,
They really do.
because we own what economists call the factors of production. I mean, most people just think of that as labor, right? Like, we just go to work.
Sure, that's the most visible part.
But it's more than that. The source material points out, we provide the labor, yes, but we also provide the land, the capital, and the entrepreneurship to these firms.
And those firms, well, they have to compensate the households for utilizing those factors. So the water starts flowing through the system.
Okay, so they pay us.
Exactly. For our labor, they pay us wages. For the use of our land, they pay rent. For our capital, they pay interest. And for our entrepreneurship, they distribute profits.
So now we, the households, have all this income. We're flush with cash in this beautifully elegant two-sector model. What do we actually do with it?
Well, theoretically, we turn right around and spend every single penny.
Every penny.
Every single penny buying the goods and services that the firms just produced.
So the firms get that money back. They use it to hire us again. We buy more stuff. And the wheel just spins in this perfect, infinite loop.
It is a mathematically perfect, closed system. But the problem, of course, is that human nature fundamentally ruins that perfection.
Right, because real human beings do not spend every single dime they make the exact moment it hits their bank account.
No, we save for a rainy day.
Exactly.
We forego current consumption to ensure we have some security for future consumption. But, the moment households stop spending a portion of their income, water is essentially leaking out of our economic cycle.
Which introduces us to the five-sector model. The ecosystem gets, well, infinitely more complicated.
It has to, because those savings have to go somewhere. So we add a financial sector, the banks.
Right.
Then we have to add a government sector because they step in and take a chunk of our income in taxes.
Unavoidable.
Right. And finally, we add an overseas sector because households don't just buy locally produced goods. I mean, we buy imported cars, electronics, food.
So now you have three distinct things, which the models call leakages, escaping the main flow.
Right,
We've
yeah.
got savings, taxes, and imports.
Yeah, this is money that is actively leaving the domestic cycle of households buying from domestic firms.
And think about the mechanics of that. I mean, if money only ever leaked out, the flow would just get weaker and weaker until the entire domestic economy dried up completely.
But the system has intake valves to balance it out.
The injections.
Exactly. The models call these injections. It's basically rainfall replenishing the ecosystem.
So how does that work?
Well, the banks don't just sit on our savings in a vault. They loan that money out to firms for investment in, say, new factories or new technologies.
Oh, right.
And the government takes our taxes and injects the value back through government spending, building highways, funding schools, paying for national defense.
And the overseas sector.
They buy our exports, which pumps foreign money directly into our domestic firms.
Which brings us to the fundamental rule of macroeconomic stability here, which is equilibrium.
Yes.
An economy is only balanced when the total leakages equal the total injections. If injections are higher, if it's raining heavily, basically, the national output expands.
And if leakages are higher, if evaporation outpaces the rain, the economy literally shrinks.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you right here.
Sure. What's up?
Because as I was digging through the breakdown of these injections and the sources, I found something that completely broke my intuition.
Oh, I think I know what you're going to say.
The material explicitly states that transfer payments, things like government pensions, unemployment benefits, child tax credits, are absolutely not considered injections.
Right.
Wait, how is the government literally mailing checks to millions of citizens not an injection of money into the economy?
It is a brilliant catch, and honestly, it's a concept that trips up almost everyone when they first look at macroeconomics.
It just seems so counterintuitive.
It does. From the perspective of the person receiving the pension check, it absolutely feels like an injection. I mean, they have more money.
Yeah.
But you have to look at the economy from a bird's eye view. Remember the core definition of this cycle. An injection has to represent expenditure on new goods and services.
Oh, so it's about creating something that literally didn't exist yesterday.
Exactly that. When the government decides to build a new bridge, they are creating new output.
Right.
They are actively hiring construction workers. They're buying raw steel, pouring concrete. That is a true injection.
Okay.
But when the government taxes a working citizen to pay for another citizen's unemployment benefit, no new good or service was created in that transaction.
Ah, okay. So they just moved existing water from one side of the forest to the other.
You nailed it. They took existing income from one part of the flow and simply transferred it. Hence, transfer payment.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, they didn't turn on a new hose. So mathematically, a transfer payment doesn't add to the total size of the economy. It just changes who gets to spend the money.
Okay, framed around new output, that makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
So we have this vast system of money flowing, leaking out, getting injected back in. How do economists actually keep score?
That is the big question.
Like, if we want to know if the forest is growing or dying, how do we measure it?
This is where we introduce the most heavily scrutinized macroeconomic variable in existence, gross domestic product, or GDP.
GDP.
Yeah.
Right. The technical definition from the slides here is the total monetary value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific time period, which is usually a year.
And that word final is doing a massive amount of heavy lifting in that sentence.
It has to, right? Otherwise, the entire metric collapses under the weight of double counting.
Absolutely.
The classic example the source gives is a car rolling off an assembly line. When you calculate GDP, you only count the final price of that brand new car when it is sold to the consumer.
Right.
You absolutely do not count the value of the raw steel that the metal manufacturer sold to the auto company to build the frame.
And think about why that is. If you counted the, say, $2,000 worth of steel when it was produced, and then you counted the $30,000 car that contains that exact same steel.
You've just counted the metal twice.
Exactly. You would be artificially inflating the size of the economy by counting all the intermediate steps.
So we only measure the final destination.
Yes.
And when it comes to actually calculating this massive number, the frameworks present a really fascinating rule of three.
It's a great concept.
It's almost like being a forensic accountant trying to audit a massive global corporation. There are three completely different ways to calculate national income, and theoretically, they should all arrive at the exact same dollar amount.
It's a beautifully symmetrical concept. National output equals national income equals national expenditure.
Let's walk the listener through the audit.
Sure.
Method 1 is the output method. You literally walk through the metaphorical warehouse and add up the value of all production.
Right.
You take the primary sector, the raw materials from mining, agriculture, forestry. You add that to the secondary sector, which is manufacturing and construction.
And then you add the tertiary sector, the services, retail, healthcare, all of that.
Exactly. So that's method 1.
Method 2 is the income method. Instead of looking at what was physically made, you look at the payroll.
The money side.
Yeah, you add up all the wages paid to labor, the rent paid to landowners, the interest paid to capital, and the profits earned by entrepreneurs.
And finally, method 3 is the expenditure method. You just look at the receipts, like what was actually spent.
Right, who bought all this stuff?
You add up consumption by households, investment by firms, government spending, and net exports, which is just your total exports minus your imports.
That is the classic macroeconomic equation. C plus I plus G plus X minus M.
It's basically tattooed on every economics student's brain.
Oh, absolutely. And in a purely theoretical vacuum, output, income, and expenditure match down to the very last cent.
But we don't live in a vacuum. The frameworks point out a rather messy reality.
They do.
In practice, there is always what they call a statistical discrepancy.
Because data collection at this scale is notoriously fundamentally flawed.
I can only imagine.
You are trying to track millions of microtransactions across hundreds of thousands of square miles. You have businesses making basic accounting errors.
Or complex supply chains obscuring the true value of imports.
Exactly. And you have a massive shadow economy of people hiding income from the tax authorities. So naturally, the three methods never perfectly align.
Which leads us to a really uncomfortable question.
Mhm.
Having a scoreboard is great, but what if the scoreboard is fundamentally lying to us?
That is the crucial pivot here.
Yeah, does a high GDP actually tell us if a country and its citizens are doing well?
Going from just knowing how to calculate the numbers to understanding what they actually represent is huge, and the limitations of GDP as a proxy for human well-being are vast.
The first limitation that jumped out at me in the source was the distinction between GDP and GNP gross national product.
A very common
I
confusion.
think most people assume those acronyms are basically interchangeable, but they measure completely different philosophies, right? Geography versus ownership.
Exactly. GDP is strictly geographical. It only cares about where the economic activity physically happens.
The borders.
Right. GNP, on the other hand, cares about who actually owns the assets generating that activity, regardless of where they are located in the world.
So imagine a massive Indian multinational corporation opens a sprawling, highly profitable manufacturing plant in Canada.
Okay.
Because that factory is on Canadian soil using Canadian infrastructure. All of the economic activity and output generated there counts toward Canada's GDP.
Correct.
But it does not count toward Canada's GNP. It counts toward India's GNP because India owns the productive assets and ultimately claims the profits.
It's a really vital distinction because it tells you where the wealth is actually accumulating versus where the manual labor is just happening.
Wow.
But the flaws in the scoreboard go much deeper than just geography.
Which brings us back to that parade I mentioned at the very beginning of the deep dive, the illusion of inflation.
Ah, yes.
It is critical for you to understand the difference between nominal GDP and real GDP.
Nominal GDP is simply the raw monetary value of everything produced measured in current everyday prices.
So imagine a hypothetical country whose entire economy consists of producing exactly 1 million apples a year.
Okay, simple enough.
In year one, an apple costs $1. Their nominal GDP is $1 million.
Makes sense.
In year two, they still produce exactly 1 million apples. Absolutely zero new economic activity occurred. But because of inflation, the price of an apple has doubled to $2.
Right.
Suddenly, their nominal GDP is $2 million.
And if you only look at that nominal figure, the politicians are out there throwing a parade, boasting that they literally doubled the size of the economy.
But if you walk out into the street, no one actually has more food.
Exactly. The standard of living hasn't improved by a single percentage point. It is a complete illusion created by money losing its value.
So how do we strip that illusion away?
Economists apply a mathematical tool called a GDP deflator. Essentially, it filters out the inflation by adjusting the value to constant historical prices.
Okay.
This gives us real GDP. Whenever you encounter the word real in an economic context, it just means the numbers have been adjusted for inflation.
So tracking real GDP is the only intellectually honest way to compare economic growth across different years. Okay, so we filter out the inflation. But if we connect this to the everyday experience of the listener, does a high real GDP mean that people living in that country actually have a high standard of living?
Not necessarily, no, because you have to factor in how many people are sitting at the dinner table sharing that wealth.
Oh, right. The numbers on this in the source are staggering. Take China and Canada.
Let's hear it.
China has a massive, towering total GDP of around $18.7 trillion. Canada's total GDP is a fraction of that. They're roughly $2.3 trillion.
So if you were just looking at the national scoreboard, China appears vastly wealthier.
Exactly. But wealth isn't experienced at the national level, it's experienced at the individual level.
Right, down on the ground.
China has over 1.4 billion people sharing that $18.7 trillion. Canada only has about 30 million people sharing their $2.3 trillion.
That's a huge difference in distribution.
So when you divide the total pie by the population, giving you the GDP per capita, the entire narrative just flips.
It does.
China's GDP per capita sits around $13,000. Canada's is over $53,000.
Wow.
The average citizen in Canada has a substantially higher standard of living, even though their overall national engine is so much smaller.
And, even if you use GDP per capita, you are still missing a massive, invisible portion of the human experience.
Because GDP only registers transactions that have a formal price tag.
Exactly, the hidden economy.
Think about all the incredibly productive, vital work that happens entirely off the books, like unpaid household chores, caring for elderly parents, or raising children at home.
Right. If you hire a professional nanny, the GDP of the country goes up.
But if you decide to stay home and do that exact same exhausting work yourself, the GDP registers absolute zero.
It's wild. You also have subsistence farming in developing nations, millions of people growing their own food to survive.
It literally sustains human life.
But because it never enters a formal marketplace, it's invisible to the metrics. And of course, the massive parallel, underground markets, everything from unrecorded cash-in-hand jobs to illicit activities.
The metric also utterly fails to capture quality improvement.
Oh, this is a big one.
You can buy a smartphone today for, say, the same price you paid 10 years ago. But today's phone is a supercomputer compared to the old one.
Right.
GDP doesn't capture that massive leap in utility. But perhaps the most dangerous flaw we found in the materials is how GDP completely ignores negative externalities.
The environmental cost of growth.
Yes. If a corporation clear-cuts a centuries-old forest, destroys the local biodiversity, and dumps chemical runoff into the river just to manufacture cheap particle board furniture.
GDP counts the sale of that furniture as pure, unadulterated economic growth.
It entirely ignores the depletion of natural resources and the long-term cost of that pollution.
Which is exactly why a growing chorus of economists advocate for calculating a green GDP.
Green GDP.
Yeah, the formula is intuitive. You take traditional GDP and you mathematically subtract the environmental costs of production.
Oh, wow.
You deduct the cost of air pollution, water cleanup, waste disposal, resource depletion. It provides a much more sobering, honest picture of whether a country's growth is actually sustainable.
That makes a lot of sense. And finally, there's the non-consumer good issue.
Right.
A country's GDP could be skyrocketing simply because the government is spending billions of dollars manufacturing fighter jets, tanks, and missiles.
Yeah.
That massive output makes the economy look incredibly strong on paper, but it doesn't directly raise the living standards or the happiness of regular citizens. I mean, you can't eat a fighter jet.
Very true. So we've firmly established that GDP is a deeply flawed metric.
Very flawed.
But realistically, it remains the primary dashboard we have. And when we map a country's real GDP over several decades, a very distinct pattern emerges. The economy does not grow in a straight, steady, upward line.
It's a roller coaster.
Precisely. It's what economists call the business cycle. Economies naturally experience periodic, often violent fluctuations in activity.
And the sources outline 4 distinct phases to this ride. First, you have the expansion phase. The economy is growing, businesses are hiring, unemployment is dropping.
Everyone is happy.
Right. But eventually you hit the peak. This is maximum GDP. But at the peak, you run into capacity constraints. You literally run out of available workers and raw materials, which causes inflation to surge.
Because aggregate demand, the total spending by everyone in the economy, is completely outstripping the economy's ability to supply goods.
And when that happens, the roller coaster tips over the edge into a contraction or a recession.
The scary part of the ride.
Exactly. Consumption and investment fall. Firms see their sales drop, so they lay off workers. Unemployment rises. And because people lose their jobs, they consume even less.
It becomes a mechanical, vicious, downward spiral until the economy hits the trough, the absolute bottom.
And then,
At which point, eventually, low interest rates and the baseline need for survival consumption stabilize the free fall, and the recovery phase begins all over again.
but it's vital to understand that this roller coaster isn't just randomly flailing in the dark, right? It fluctuates around a central long-term trend line, which represents the economy's potential output.
Yes. Potential output is the theoretical sweet spot. It is the level of production where all of a country's resources, its labor, its factories, its land, are being utilized efficiently without triggering massive inflation.
And when the roller coaster deviates from that central line, we get what economists call output gaps.
Right.
If the roller coaster drops below the potential line, a negative output gap, the economy is operating below its capacity. Factories are sitting idle. That translates directly into human unemployment.
And conversely, if the roller coaster surges above the potential line, a positive output gap, the economy is basically redlining.
It's producing beyond its sustainable capacity, which inevitably manifests as severe inflation.
So the burning question is, what actually drives these wild, volatile shifts? To understand the engine of the roller coaster, we have to look closely at aggregate supply.
Aggregate supply is the total amount of goods and services that all industries in a country will produce at a given price level. Now, in the short run, the aggregate supply curve slopes upward, meaning if the average prices in the economy go up, businesses are heavily incentivized to produce more.
Right.
Why? The underlying mechanics here are fascinating. It's driven by a concept called sticky wages, which creates what economists call the profit effect.
This is one of the most crucial mechanisms in macroeconomics.
Put yourself in the shoes of a factory owner. In the short run, your operational costs, specifically the wages you pay your labor force, are generally fixed. They are sticky.
Right, you have annual contracts, union agreements. You can't just slash or raise wages every Tuesday.
The cost of your labor is locked in place.
Exactly.
So imagine the overall price level in the broader economy suddenly rises. People are willing to pay more for your widgets. You can raise your prices, but your labor costs are still frozen by those contracts.
Your profit margins just absolutely exploded.
You were massively incentivized to turn the factory machines on high, run overnight shifts, and flood the market with more output. Higher prices combined with sticky nominal wages equals higher profits and a massive surge in supply.
But that only explains how supply changes when prices change. What happens when something fundamentally alters the cost of production across the entire board?
That creates a supply-side shock,
Right.
shifting the entire aggregate supply curve.
Yes. And the frameworks give a fantastic contrast to explain what makes a shock truly macroeconomic. They compare a spike in the price of rubber versus a spike in the price of oil.
Oh, this is a great example.
If the global price of rubber suddenly doubles, it is undoubtedly a crisis for tire manufacturers.
Sure.
But it probably won't shift the aggregate supply of the entire nation in a noticeable way. But oil.
Oil changes everything.
Oil is the lifeblood of the industrial ecosystem. A sudden increase in the price of oil impacts literally everything. Every single industry uses energy to run their buildings and fuel to transport their goods.
So what does this all mean when these theoretical models violently collide with reality? This brings us to the final piece of our puzzle.
The news snippet.
Yes, the article from The Guardian. The headline reads, UK consumer confidence has collapsed during Iran war, retail industry says.
This is where we synthesize everything we've discussed today.
How so?
A major conflict in the Middle East is the textbook trigger for a massive oil supply shock. The cost of energy skyrockets. Because energy costs more, the cost of production for nearly every single firm in the UK goes up.
So the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts violently to the left, prices spike, and overall output falls.
Exactly. But if you read the mechanics of that headline, it's not just a supply-side problem. It says consumer confidence collapsed.
Right.
That means the households, the everyday people in our circular flow model, are watching the news, they're terrified about the future, and they immediately change their behavior.
They stop spending. Consumption, which we know is a massive injection in the expenditure method, just plummets.
So what you're looking at is a devastating dual shock. Aggregate supply shifts left because energy is too expensive, and aggregate demand, the total spending shifts left because households are hoarding their cash in fear.
Think about what that does to our factory owner. They are suddenly facing skyrocketing energy bills to keep the lights on, and simultaneously, their customers have completely stopped buying their widgets.
The leakages in the economy are suddenly overwhelming the injections.
To survive, the firms have no choice but to slash costs, which means they lay off workers.
And as those workers lose their wages, their consumption drops to zero, pulling aggregate demand down even further.
The output gap goes severely negative. We're tumbling straight down the roller coaster, past the peak, directly into a deep contraction.
It is the sterile, academic theory playing out mechanically in a devastating real-world headline.
It really connects everything. It connects the foundational plumbing of the circular flow, the flawed scoreboard of GDP, and the volatile roller coaster of supply and demand into one single cohesive event.
It really does.
We started today looking at a beautifully simple ecosystem of households and firms. We traced how savings and taxes leak out like evaporation, and how investment and government spending rein back in.
We interrogated the scoreboard, too, how GDP valiantly tries to measure the size of the forest but completely ignores whether the trees are actually healthy, or if the environment's being destroyed, or if the wealth is just hoarded by a few.
And the most important takeaway for you, the listener, is that you are now fully equipped to see through the noise.
Absolutely.
Next time you hear a politician standing at a podium on the evening news bragging that GDP growth is up 4%, you don't just have to passively accept it.
You have the tools to ask the critical questions.
Right. Is that nominal growth fueled by the illusion of inflation, or is it real growth? Is it a massive total GDP, or is the GDP per capita actually improving the standard of living?
Does that number account for the negative externalities like pollution, or are we simply borrowing from our children's future to inflate today's scoreboard?
You can actually read the dashboard now. But before we go, I want to leave you with one final, slightly provocative thought from the economic literature that reframes everything we just discussed.
Oh, this is a good one.
We know the economy acts like a roller coaster, the business cycle of expansions and recessions. Economists have long debated whether those cycles are purely natural market forces.
There are dozens of competing hypotheses on this.
But one particularly cynical theory is the electoral cycle.
Right.
The source material points out this theory proposes that the macroeconomic roller coaster might actually be manipulated.
It's a fascinating idea.
What if governments intentionally use expansionary fiscal policies, like massive deficit-funded government spending and slashing taxes, to artificially engineer a massive economic boom right before a major election,
They pump the economy full of sugar so the voters feel wealthy and re-elect them.
creating a politically engineered, highly unsustainable positive output gap?
Exactly. Knowing full well that this artificial high will inevitably cause fierce inflation and capacity constraints, dragging the economy into a harsh, painful recession.
But only after the votes have been counted and they are safely back in office, leaving the pain for the beginning of the next cycle.
It's definitely something to think about.
It makes you wonder. The next time you feel the economy accelerating and prices starting to rise, are you riding a natural, inevitable wave of aggregate supply and demand? Or are you just strapped into a politically engineered theme park ride?
It forces you to question the invisible hand steering the macroeconomy.
It definitely changes how you look at the forest. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.